So my passion is to learn about other people's passions, because when someone has a chance to talk about what they're most passionate about, everything about their being becomes brighter, it becomes more real, it becomes more them. And I think that authenticity and that feeling alive and connected and present in the world is a thing I want to surround myself with all of the time. On today's episode, I am talking with the profound Ellen Balaguer. If you want to learn more about Ellen, please go to janesplace.com, where you can learn more about her and her favorite comfort food. One of the things we love to talk about at Jane's Place is passion, because passion brings out the best in every person when they talk about what they're most passionate about. So why don't you start, and I'll probably have a few questions.
I have an easy answer and a more complicated answer. The easy one is I'm a huge outdoors person. I think of the outdoors, nature, if you will, as a true sacred space. I love being out in nature. It's definitely restorative, re-energizing, etc. for me. And all the sports I'm into are all about being outside. Horseback riding, skiing, all different versions of skiing, hiking, running. Those have always been my thing. And it's interesting because the when you said comfort food, if I need comfort, I go outside. And so that's kind of the short, easy answer. And as a result, I'm, a committed and strong environmentalist and conservationist, etc. So that's the easy one. The more complicated answer is that, and this one I actually remember precisely when I adopted this mindset, if you will. I was 11, and it was a school project that sort of flipped the switch for me, turned on the light bulb, if you will, that I wanted to be somebody who made a greater net contribution than taking things away from the world, if you will. Now, I wouldn't have used that language at that point in time, but Paul Newman once said, try to leave the place a little better than you found it, meaning the earth and the planet. Yes. And I think that's a simple way of putting it. A different way of putting it, this is a quote from one of my favorite movies. There's a question in this movie where one of the characters asks the other character, are you a giver or are you a taker? And I've always really tried to keep that in mind. Oh. And that can take, this is where it gets complicated. It can take a ton of forms. If you're a student, when I was a student, it took one form of the kinds of things I did to try to be a giver. When I was a business person, many other forms. When I was a business executive and leader on a global basis, took other forms. And now as a philanthropist and trying to be a leader on boards and philanthropic causes, it takes other forms. And so it's morphed and changed over my life, but really trying to make sure that you are net contributing more than you are taking is the way I try to spend the vast majority of my minutes on this planet.
So what was it at age 11 that sparked this?
This is so super nerdy, and particularly given the time we're living in, people are going to watch this and say, yeah, that's a bunch of BS. But this is the God's honest truth. It was studying the Declaration of Independence, and I, at the ripe old age of 11, and I was insanely naive. I genuinely believed, and I'm going to play with the language a tad, that everyone is created equal, and everybody should be able to, have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I meant everybody. And, literally. As I got older, I understood the nuances of all of that, and that the actual language is all men, etc. And, we all know that. But it was that. And I was hook, line, and sinker. So that is the most important thing I can imagine.
Wow, I love that so much, and that, that it started so young in your life. But having been a global executive at one of the biggest firms in the world, did you find a lot more people were taking than giving? And how did you react to that if your own, because having grown up in the corporate world myself, and I would say in a lot of times maybe been more naive in ways than I probably should have been. Always kind of leading from my heart,
Right.
I have to say.
Right.
But you were in huge jobs with many people underneath you. How did you kind of balance your heart piece of being a giver with the reality of running a large company?
Yeah. Well, balance is always, a huge part of it. Very early in my career, a client. Some of my most important mentors were clients. I had a ton of really good ones inside of my employer as well, but some of them were clients. And and he's a local serial entrepreneur here in the Denver area. And he taught me a concept about creating a contract. And he said, I believe the definition, and especially in our business, we were in the long-term relationship business, not, we tried to always look at things from because as a services company, we very much looked at things relationally as opposed to some specific transaction that I want to eke out every nickel on. And he said, I think the definition of a good contract is that when you have it ready to sign, you would sign either side. No questions asked. And when you think about that, when you really think about that, what that is nothing more than the golden rule.
Right.
Win-win. Think in a balanced fashion and create a business circumstance that is never perfect. I always like to get my philosophy from movies. And, in Tin Cup, when Tin Cup said perfection is unattainable, he was talking about a golf swing, but
right.
It's true of the world, right? So it's not that it's perfect, but it's balanced in such a way that is fair, truly fair to both people or both parties or both organizations, however. And when you really absorb that and then say, okay, how do I create an employer-employee relationship or a partnership with a customer, a partnership with a supplier, or any kind of relationship, a marriage, right? It doesn't matter. Any sort of relationship, and you really employ the discipline to think on a truly win-win basis, then when you're dealing with people that won't think that way, you have this basis of saying, well, how else would you do it? In my experience, the number of people that when you fully lay it out and explain it won't come on board with that doesn't mean they agree with everything.
Right.
You still have lots to work out. But the principle of we're going to go to something that is win-win for both parties and that would sign either side of it, my experience is the vast majority of people buy into that. Now, I can cite a few examples. I one time was working on one of the things I did was put together our largest deals. And only once I worked with somebody who we were in the middle of one of these conversations. This was a industry impacting deal for both the client and for us. And he literally took a book or something and slammed it against the table and said, I have no interest in a win-win deal. What I have an interest in is a win-lose deal. And I said, okay, understand that. We're not interested in that.
Wow.
And, so having the courage to say, yeah, we don't work that way. You're welcome to, but not with us.
So did he end up coming your direction eventually?
He ended up getting fired by his employer, and we ended up putting that deal together. It took a little while of wrangling around, but that guy was fired.
Wow.
Now, I would like to say that that's always the answer, and all you have to do is look around in the world we live in right now and some of the things that are being celebrated in our society today to know that I'm still hopelessly naive, even though I'm a lot older than 11 now. But I do believe that most people want to behave that way and work that way. I think when people are bombarded with messages of fear, and we get people so caught up in being afraid of this outcome or this group that we want to villainize or whatever, that we can people can get so caught up in fear that it's hard to think that way. If you think from the standpoint of possibilities as opposed to scary things, if you think about, the gaps we want to fill as opposed to the gripes we have, most people, not everybody, not 100%, but I still believe that most people want to operate that way.
I agree with you 100%. And I don't think that anybody, or very many people, wake up in the morning and they go, I want to do a bad job. I want to hate somebody. I want to be like it just,
I want to screw somebody.
I want to screw somebody. Like, we're just not wired that way.
No, we are wired to be collaborative and social, but we are also wired to be fearful of change and fearful of difference. And we have to work at overcoming that. But as the old saying goes, if we can send people to the moon and send rocket ships off to Saturn, let alone Mars, I think we can learn this.
I wish that we could have a movement where we had this sort of win-win mentality, that people would not be afraid to stand up and say, like, I want to believe and I want to show up and be the glasses half full person, and I want to be. I've never heard of this. The sign both sides of the contract. I love
Isn't that a great?
It's actually an amazing thing to think about. It really is.
It's and I think, for example, because I think I work a great deal with business students, that it's one thing to talk about these big lofty ideas, and so you say, okay, let's bring it down to earth and let's use this as a teachable moment and say, okay, let's take a case example and let's talk about some arrangement we're trying to put in place between this organization and that organization, and let's work out, how do you go to the middle? How do you find this place that's balanced? How do you learn to create a give and take between both sides? And an amazing thing is if one party sees the other party working to create this, working to say, here's a give, here's a take, here's a give, here's a take, and let's alternate in that. As I said, when you kind of teach people to think this way,
right.
And sometimes I have had the experience of having to teach lawyers to think this way, because sometimes corporate lawyers in particular are trained to try to optimize outcomes for their client. And that may work in the short term, but you say, no, let's play this out and let's think a few years out. Do you see how trying to optimize and eke out every last cent in the near term doesn't play out necessarily in the long term, meaning 4 or 5 years from now? If you're in the long-term relationship business, you don't have the luxury of thinking, I'm just going to, try to squeeze every last nickel out of you in this initial transaction for 6 months. It trains you to think differently and to put yourself in both sides, if you will. I think that can be taught. And so as soon as you say, oh, okay, I just have to get it's like I like to think of it as a bit of a jigsaw puzzle. Mm-hmm. You put all the pieces on the table and you say, okay, how can I get them to fit together? Well, maybe there's an alternate way to get them to fit together, etc. Once it becomes a solvable puzzle, then it doesn't seem so daunting and it doesn't seem so pie in the sky, mushy naivete.
Right. So this is so amazing to me, because I've recently been in a couple of negotiations, and I always try to go in with a win-win attitude, but there's also the idea of wanting to be the ultimate winner yourself in a negotiation. So this is so helpful for me. So how, for the listeners that we've got, just any advice that how do you take the high road? How do you, when you get into that situation, again, maybe it's going back to the example of the guy you just said, hey, I can walk away from it. Not everybody can walk away from every deal. Just any just thoughts on that, just because I do think there's something that's so powerful here that I'm learning myself even about. I go into everything with the glasses half full and I want to win-win, but do I always? I'm not sure now that I'm here and you talk about this.
Well, one thing is this concept of time frame. Because a deal that is overly skewed to one party or the other won't sustain itself. Right. Think about a marriage. If there's a serious power imbalance in the marriage, the contract might survive, but you might have one party that's very, very unhappy and so it's not a healthy relationship. So one thing is to use the time frame element to think things out and say, does this go to an imbalanced place 3-4 years from now? So let's back up and say, how do we rectify that? That's one thing. The other thing is the concept of trade-offs and everybody giving and taking. I know one thing that, a famous entrepreneur here in town, Brad Feld, has his concept of give first. Mm-hmm. It's the exact same thing. Here's an analogy I've used is, this is sort of taking a military example and applying it, but so much of business lingo a lot of times comes from the military. All right, so think about, in Korea, along the border, there's the DMZ, or the demilitarized zone. So I have the border of South Korea and the border of North Korea, and then I have this zone in the middle, or the demilitarized zone. And the point of that, philosophically, is that if I am sitting on top of a border, my ability to violate that is I have very little room for error. There's no margin for error. When I create a DMZ, this is kind of my margin for error. So if somebody screws up a little bit and comes a little bit this way or a little bit that way, we don't have a nuclear war in our hands. Right. There's a buffer zone, if you will. In the form of a business contract, what that buffer zone represents is money. Mm-hmm. And here's what I mean about the short term versus the long term. In here, a bunch of nickels. Do I have to get every last nickel right now out of this deal? Or over a period of 3 or 4 years, will I end up with more nickels because I've built a sustainable relationship as opposed to being very transactional? Now, that means thinking that way. It also means, for public companies in this country, having the willingness to push on the analysts who are so focused on this quarter.
Right.
I understand the challenge that any CEO of any public company, or even for that matter, private companies that are responding to investors and shareholders, of near-term earnings. That's why I keep emphasizing the time frame component, because that changes the mix. I kind of defy anybody. I can take, having done this a bunch, virtually any arrangement and say, if you look at it in this time frame versus that time frame, right, you get a different answer.
Wow. Thank you so much for this, Ellen. Honestly, I feel like I've had a master class in like contract negotiations. I mean, this is so helpful. It really is. And then just going back to your whole passion about giving versus taking. Ellen and I have known each other for more than a decade through our involvement at the Leeds School of Business at the University of Colorado. In all those years, we have always been focused on the student interactions and not on her big, impactful, fabulous career. In fact, as I reflect on it now, she is so modest about it and always turns the table and asks me about where I am at in my career. Now that I've talked to Ellen about her passion to be a giver, it all makes sense to me. When she talked about how to make a win-win, she said she needed to ask herself if she could sign the contract from both sides. This truly resonated with me, especially given recent negotiations that I have been in. So my questions for me and for you. First, do we believe a win-win is possible as an operating principle? If yes, how do we make it happen? And finally, are we a giver or a taker? There is no right answer here. Just be true to how we look at the world. Special thanks to Jane's Place fabulous producer, Aditi Joshi, who made my passion a reality. I am also so appreciative that the amazing musician, Tim Cook, provided the lively music from the Subdudes called Them Figs. This podcast was brought to you by Rudy's Bakery new gluten-free Sandos with Justin's Nut Butter and from our friends at Naturally Colorado. I want to keep asking questions that matter, and I want this to feel like a space where your story belongs too. If there's something you want to talk about, a moment, a memory, a shift you're going through, Jane's Place door is always open. Truly. You can drop me a note on the website, join a future episode, or simply listen in when you're ready. Because Jane's Place isn't just a podcast, it's a gathering. And I'm so grateful that you're here.